So let us start our new session. Again, welcome to everybody. So in the academic session of this morning, we started from the context in which Matteo Ricci was living, and we focused on some Chinese persons, Xuyi, how his relation was with Matteo Ricci, and we also discovered some of the legacy until the 19th and 20th century. And then we had the second presentation where we saw the legacy at the end of the Ming Dynasty, which means in the years 1630s, 1640s, how some stories by Matteo Ricci were transmitted and already took life. And again, there was a focus on Chinese, not only the author who composed that story, or let's say who composed that book, but also about the Chinese in the story itself. Now we move further, and we will continue on this topic of legacy, heritage, to see how Ricci's story started here in Europe. It will be a presentation first on Nicolas Trigault, who went to China, who came back to Europe and went to China again. We will hear about that very soon, and then we will move a little bit more to the present day by a presentation of what is the person of Matteo Ricci. And then there will be a third presentation. I can already announce that unfortunately Anthony Clark could not come because he needs to undergo a surgery, but there will be an audio presentation by him, so that will still be there. So let us start with the first presentation, and it is about Nicolas Trigault, and this will be presented by Nicolas Lewis. So we have three Nicolas here. And Nicolas Lewis, we know each other already also for several years. He obtained his PhD last year in St. Louis University. He is now more in administration, in the Office of Research of the university, but he has spent a long time on studying the figure of Nicolas Trigault. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. 1 second while I start my timer so I don't go over. I wanted to start out this presentation with gratitude. I'd like to thank RC, the Pontifical University, Boston College, all of the people who have helped sponsored and put this together, not to mention our friends in the translation booth who are helping someone like me who Italian is my third language, be able to present at a conference like this. I'd also like to personally thank Father Festo Makenda for offering the opportunity a while back to come to Rome. This is a great opportunity for me personally, but it's also just a great excuse to use vacation days to come to Italy. Most of the presentations we've seen today have talked about Matteo Ricci as a man, as a missionary, as a friend. Valentina's presentation earlier brought up the idea of him as a memory or a literary figure, one who could be contrasted later. Over the past year, I've been encouraged to think about historical figures and historical memory as multiplicitous. Obviously, there was only one physical Matteo Ricci who existed in history, but throughout our memory of that history, that we have seen multiple editions of Matteo Ricci, shall we say. Each one of them has their own history. Each one of them has their own meaning to the group that they are indebted to. Here in this room, I think we have the sense of the scholarly Ricci, whose ideas about enculturation and his intense linguistic study shed light on the compatibility, or the lack thereof, of early modern Catholicism and Confucian thought. Outside of this room, but not too far away, there was the Ricci of Pope Francis, who, after Ricci received the title of Venerable in 2022, he referred to Ricci as the Apostle of China and a man of encounters who went beyond being a foreigner and became a citizen of the world. There is also the political Ricci, the conceptual and the historical bridge between the Vatican and the modern Chinese Communist Party. Of course, going back in time, there is the Ricci of Fathers Pietro Tacci Venturi and Pasquale d'Elia, who subsumed Ricci promoted Ricci as a symbol of Italian supremacy, worthy of being used as a propaganda tool under the fascist regime. I owe Rafael Perin of Università Cattolica di Sacro Cuore for introducing me to that Ricci. And finally, there is the Ricci that exists in the annals of the Chinese mission. He is the founder, the first mover, and potentially the patron saint of China. This is a Ricci that goes back at least to the physical Ricci's death in 1610. And he was first conceived of by the Jesuits in China as a means to secure space in Beijing from the Wanli Emperor in what is now Xialan Cemetery. The Ricci I want to talk about, though, is none of those Riccis. The Ricci I'm interested in arrived in Il Gesù here in Rome on October 11, 1614. He was carried by Ricci's Jesuit confrere, Nicolas Trigault. This Ricci came in the form of an idea, best consolidated in the form of a book, De Christiana Expeditione apud Sinas. Based on Ricci's original memoirs of his time in China, this translation into Latin would bring Ricci's legend out of China and push the legend of the Chinese mission into mainland Europe, colonial America, and India. There's a lot to discuss about this book, but first I want to give some background on who Trigault was and why a Jesuit missionary in China suddenly came back to Rome in the first place. Trigault had arrived in China in 1610 by way of Lisbon, Mozambique, and then India. He spent a short 2 years in the interior, learning the Chinese language and helping to set up the first stable mission in Hangzhou, China, alongside Father Lázaro Cataneo and Brother Sebastian Fernandez. In Hangzhou, he became acquainted with the radical enculturation of Jesuit accommodation practiced in China, and he saw firsthand the effectiveness of the Riccian method. Trigault found himself back in Beijing in late 1612, however. The Hangzhou mission had been put on hiatus due to Lázaro Cataneo's ill health, and the mission superior, Nicola Longobardo, Ricci's successor, found himself with the spare Jesuit for a change. At that moment, the China mission was on the brink of collapse. Financially, the two main revenue streams that supported the mission from Europe, alms from the King of Portugal and duties levied on silk and silver that passed through Portuguese-owned port cities, were becoming increasingly tenuous. Bad weather, Portuguese mismanagement, Chinese pirates, and of course, the Dutch, all endangered the subsidy of cruzados that the mission relied on. Indeed, the full amount of their subsidy hadn't been paid to the Jesuits since 1606. If the China Jesuits could count on their Japanese superiors for support, and that is a big if, as of 1612, the beginning of anti-Christian persecution in Japan and the death of Francesco Passio, the visitor of Japan and China, both made Longobardo less inclined to seek support from the East. While the China mission would eventually benefit from the freed up resources following the end of Japan's Christian century, as of 1612, Longobardo had at his disposal only 16 Jesuits. They were spread across five permanent missions and multiple expeditions out into the countryside to convert, and this contained as much of a land area as most of Western Europe, at least several European nations put together. Even with the support of indigenous Chinese, including Mandarins, coadjutor brothers, and unfree laborers, at any point, this support could be taken away if the Jesuits filed favor with local governors. This, in fact, happened only a few years later in Nanjing in 1616. And for the Portuguese, who could only trade as far as Guangzhou, there was actually little interest in making mainland China a priority in terms of salvation mission, given that the number of new converts was less than 1% of the number that had been saved in Japan up to that point. There was simply no way to make the mission sustainable without taking some unconventional action. Faced with these exigencies, Niccolò Longobardo took the extreme measure of making his own visitor in light of Francisco Pazio's passing. He appointed Trigault as China's first visitor procurator, an ad hoc office that the China mission would use several more times throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. He ordered Trigault to return home to Rome, and although he gave Trigault some discretion about how he did it, Longobardo gave Trigault three broad tasks. First, secure new sources of patronage, especially in France, Flanders, and Germany, to support the mission. 2, recruit more missionaries, any will do. 3, negotiate the China mission's independence from the Japanese provincial and get them out from under the ongoing persecutions and the stress that would cause. What Longobardo proposed to do was actually very illegal. He was not only directly undermining the authority of his superiors in Japan, but he was also undermining the authority of the Portuguese Padroado. As such, to help make an end run around the territorial hangups needed for this mission to succeed, Longobardo had Trigault travel through Central Asia, into the Middle East, Egypt, and the Mediterranean into Rome. When Trigault arrived at Il Gesù on 11 October 1614, he did so in an exhausted state. The translation he had been working on was only half finished because the bumpiness of caravan travel was not well suited for writing a book. It would not be finished until February 14, 1615, and it wouldn't be on the presses until May 30th, 1615, from Augsburg, the capital of the Holy Roman Empire, rather than a Portuguese press. De Christiana Expeditione started as a combination of memoirs and travel guides written by Matteo Ricci. At some point near the end of his life, Ricci saw it fit to write down his experiences and share his knowledge that he had received during his 3 decades spent in China. The work is split into 5 books. The first one is a geographic, political, and cultural summary of China, meant to serve as an introduction for people who weren't well acquainted with Chinese customs. The latter 4 books retrace Ricci's various accomplishments during his stay in China up to his death in 1610. Not all of the original manuscript was written by Ricci. Several portions are written in Portuguese rather than Ricci's native Italian, and it's likely that these were inserted from the annual letters or other Jesuit writings at the time. Ricci's motivation for writing these memoirs isn't clear, but at least some of its use after the fact was to introduce new Jesuits to the mission. Trigault, coming in 1610, was likely one of the first new recruits to have learned about China through Ricci's memoirs, and it seems that something in the book resonated with him, because by all accounts, it was Trigault who came up with the idea of translating Ricci into Latin as part of his visitor procurator duties. Trigault ultimately wanted to compose a history of the China mission for European consumption, and Ricci's memoirs provided the solid base to do so. That being said, De Christiana Expeditione is a very different book than Ricci's memoirs. One of the key distinctions that very few people prior to the 20th century actually read what Ricci had written. The first published copies of Ricci's autograph come from the collections of Ricciana by Pasquale Delia and Pietro Tacci Venturi. And as of this presentation, that book has never been translated out of the original Italian and Portuguese. Within a decade of its publication, however, De Christiana had been translated into German, French, Spanish, Italian, and even Polish, and it had been excerpted by Protestants in England and in the Netherlands. A full English translation eventually came with Father Louis Gallagher's China in the 16th century and the 20th century, and a Chinese translation came not too long after. I'm saying all of this to underline the fact that it's through Trigault's translation of Ricci that non-Chinese came to learn about Ricci. And because of that, Trigault is the creator of the myth of Ricci in the West. As I mentioned, there are substantial differences between the text, and this has aroused scholarly controversy. There have been questions raised about how much of this work is actually a translation rather than a fraudulent misrepresentation of Ricci's original meaning. One of the most direct points of comparison is how Trigault and Ricci handled Confucianism as a religion. I'll avoid getting into too much detail, but in short, Trigault depicted Confucianism distinctly as a non-religion, arguing that the Chinese were actually atheist, and that Confucianism was a moral philosophy compatible with Tridentine Catholicism. The difference between his treatment and Ricci's is subtle, it's nuanced, and it's complex, and it's very important, but the actual content of these differences is a bit overstated. Trigault, more often than not, correctly represented what Ricci thought about Confucianism, though perhaps not necessarily what the Chinese thought about Confucianism themselves. And he had to somehow explain this concept of irreligion to a European audience, which, along with the translation from Italian into Latin, posed its own problems. But most of the issues that scholars have with De Christiana as a translation aren't that Trigault was not transparent about the changes he made, but that he was not invisible, in the words of Lawrence Venuti, the famous translation scholar. It's often obvious when Trigault is interjecting himself into the narrative. For example, Ricci did not compare the Chinese fuel source Mui to pitch found in the Diocese of Liege, as Ricci probably did not have that in his habitus to make that comparison. Ricci also did not praise himself while arguing for his own humility, because that would defeat the point. Ricci did not beg for alms in subtle ways throughout the book, because his audience were Jesuits who had little but themselves to give. And finally, and most obviously, Ricci did not write about his death and funeral, because if he had, he would have been canonized a long, long time ago. There's one part where Trigault is being elusive, but it actually has nothing to do with Ricci. Trigault recounts the story of a Jesuit recently having come to China from Europe who was sent to live for 20 days with a recently converted literatus. This literatus was interested in discussing science, philosophy, theology, and all sorts of other matters. But the Jesuit himself had not learned Chinese, so the entire conversation had to be translated via an interpreter, something that seemed to bring the missionary a lot of shame. And the reason why Trigault is elusive in this passage is because he was the illiterate Jesuit. The story is oddly similar to his encounter with Li Shishao in Hangzhou, as it was recounted in the annual letters. It is because Trigault compiled all of this and he made so many interventions that we have a Riccian legend. Father Sosa, I think, was the first one today to mention Francis Xavier and try to put him in relationship to Matteo Ricci. That is a practice that begins with Trigault. Matteo Ricci does not write about Francis Xavier in his memoirs. Any mention of Xavier, for the most part, was inserted later. And of course, one of the biggest one of the biggest image contributions is the frontispiece, in which Matteo Ricci and Francis Xavier are put side by side on columns. They are meant to be representing a vector of time. Xavier is the beginning, Matteo Ricci is the culmination of a prophecy that Trigault says that Xavier started when he failed to get into China at the port of Xiangguan. Of course, another sort of lead that may get buried here is that this Ricci is one that you have seen already on the side. That is basically entirely repurposed from his position on Euclid's Elements, which we have seen several times today. That being said, there are some slight differences. The fan is taken out of Ricci's hand in Trigault's frontispiece. It's replaced with an IHS. My suspicion is that this is one way to signal that this man was in fact an Italian priest and a Jesuit and not a Chinese scholar, because otherwise you may have gotten the point confused. Europeans of the 17th century may have gotten that point confused. But not only is Xavier juxtaposed with Ricci, thus conveying some of his sacral nature, but as I mentioned, the fact that they're bookending the frontispiece demonstrates a vector of time. But that's not where the comparison ends. Trigault, in fact, included an entire chapter at the beginning of Book 2 ascribing the founding of the mission to Xavier. Xavier is the beginning of the China mission, while Ricci represents its most modern form. Ricci is Xavier's successor, with all the notoriety and esteem that should accompany that. Nonetheless, this is not the only time that Xavier comes up. Matteo Ricci's death is also an important point of comparison here, because death for an early modern Catholic was as important as how they lived in terms of determining their sanctity. So something that's actually pretty astounding about this book is that there aren't that many miracle stories. We have visions and we have accounts of some form of prophecy, but we don't see Ricci healing the sick or raising the dead, and we don't really see divine intervention all that often. Obviously, natural and human circumstances happen that are ascribed to God's plan to either test or encourage Ricci on his journey, but there are a few signs or symbols attributed to God's direct mediation. Ricci's death is the one example. Trigault reports that following his death, Ricci's body remained uncorrupted, the way that a saint's should be. He does add, though, that Unlike Xavier, Ricci's body had to do more because it had to suffer the high temperatures and humidities of a Chinese summer. The preservation of his body wasn't the only parallel drawn to Xavier. Much like how Xavier was the author of the Chinese mission, Ricci had an extra description added. When he died, he was the mission's author and prime mover, and in death, he was the first to find a resting place in that kingdom, as well as to provide the same for his companions. He would have been not the first European to have been buried in China, because there were several interactions throughout the medieval period, but he would have been the first Jesuit to have died in China and been buried there, been allowed to be buried there at that. There are other praises for Ricci. Trigault praises his humility, his indefatigable spirit. He praises his willingness to help out converts in the countryside, no matter what their rank, and he was also very supportive of his Jesuit confreres in China. All these things made Ricci something that should be venerated, if not canonized, although it is my belief that part of the reason why he translated this book was to make Matteo Ricci a saint. And while that's the Matteo Ricci that Trigault presented, that's probably not the one that Europeans actually received in 1615. In fact, it's actually very difficult to tell what the immediate impact of Ricci was on Europeans, how much Europeans received the Riccian myth and counted him as something separate from the mission in general. We do know that the Jesuits would read De Christiana at the dinner table, same as they would any other missionary narrative or letter. We know that scientists, artists, and men of the court read the book because they began to treat sinology as an academic discipline. But in my estimation, Ricci himself actually wasn't the topic of discussion nor the topic of interest, especially not in the same way that Francis Xavier was, because by 1615, it was a matter of when and not if Francis Xavier became a saint. No matter how hard Trigault tried to make him that level of notoriety, the parts that interested Europeans at that time seemed to have been China as a nation, the possibilities that it included, but mostly Trigault himself. One of the things that struck me as I did my doctoral research on Trigault is that I didn't have to go very far to find references to him. When Trigault arrived at the Scholasticate in Ingolstadt in 1616, the students greeted him with two anagrams of his name, Suavis Ignati Cultor, sweet follower of Ignatius, and Gratis Incultis Vivat, may he long live as a welcome resident. But one of the most direct sources are the Literae Indipitae, petitions from potential missionaries asking to be sent to the Indies, which at this point meant any foreign mission. These letters exploded in popularity in the 1610s, parallel to Trigault's procuratorship, especially in the areas in which he actually traveled, Germany, Flanders, France. Some Indipitae reference Trigault directly, such as this one. Some of them were written directly to him rather than the superior general who was supposed to receive them and make that determination on Trigault's behalf. But it's not just Jesuits that are talking about Trigault, or to Trigault. The Archdukes of Bavaria regularly traded correspondence with Trigault and his socius, Johann Schreck Terentius, and Trigault had made a great impression to the King of Spain, the Duke of Tuscany, the Queen Mother of France, and the Archduke of the Habsburg Netherlands, all of whom contributed alms and other scientific instruments to the cause of the China mission. And of course, visually, Trigault's portrait by Peter Paul Rubens, the painter laureate of the Northern Baroque movement, gave Europeans their first full-colored look at what Chinese Catholicism actually looked like. Just as a non-scholarly digression, I checked Wikipedia before coming here. The first image for the Jesuit China mission is, well, it's Athanasius Kircher's China Illustrata, but not too far down the page before you get any image of Ricci himself, there is this sketching of Nicolas Trigault, specifically under the subheading Arrival of the Jesuits. So there, even in some of the popular consciousness, this image takes precedence over Ricci himself. One of the points of scholarly consternation about De Christiana is that outside of the lens of time, it seems like Trigault is accepting authorship for a work that he did not make. So indeed, like as you can see here, his name does appear much bigger on the frontispiece, than Matteo Ricci's. And as more editions were produced, Ricci's name tended to grow smaller and smaller until some editions of the 1630s printing, it disappeared completely. Scholars are asked, was Trigault engaging in duplicity? Was he trying to plagiarize? Was he doing some form of Renaissance imitatio? Was he doing a commentary, which is on the book? Was he doing a collaboration? Or was he part of some cumulative fraud? And in my estimation, Trigault probably would have agreed with all of those, maybe not the fraud, but he was aware of the variegated nature of the book that he never really claimed sole authorship of. It's also clear through the title, the dedication, the introduction, references to other Jesuit histories that he consulted, the usage of the third person, that Trigault expected his audience would be aware that not all the text had come from him originally. Not only that, but he didn't necessarily want it to, because his goal was to make Matteo Ricci a saint. But De Christiana Expeditione needed an author's name, and considering that it had been his personal project, published as part of his duties as procurator, a contemporary audience likely found his name as engaging as any other. Because of that, however, Trigault, at least in the immediate aftermath, became the Jesuit synonymous with the China mission in Europe. At least for a brief period. He would eventually be supplanted by other Jesuit procurators and scientists such as Adam Chalvon Bell, Martino Martini, Philippe Couplet, and by the end of the 17th century and the 18th century, Jesuits who had never even set foot in China, such as Athanasius Kircher and Jean-Baptiste Duhalde, the latter of which became the political commentator most cited by the Enlightenment philosophers when they talked about Chinese enlightened absolutism. So the question at that point sort of becomes, when did the myth of Ricci begin? When was it his turn to become synonymous with Chinese Catholicism? I don't have a clear-cut answer, unfortunate as that is. My suspicion is that he came about during the fascist regime in Italy because of the work of archivists who wanted him to use him as an ideal of Italian nationalism. But at the same time, Francis Rouleau was working in the United States, setting up institutions that would also carry his name later on. So at the end of the day, this is pretty hard to gauge. But even the segments of the Chinese Rite controversy don't deal with what Matteo Ricci actually did or who he actually was. They deal with him as an idea, and they deal with him as a method, not a man. So as much as Trigault tried to make Ricci a saint, both through the apostolate of the press and the apostolate an den Mann zu bringen, the actual arrival of Matteo Ricci in Europe was fairly subdued, perhaps for a couple of centuries after. Thank you. Not bad.
So thank you very much for this talk. I think it really joins the theme of our conference and tracing back how early, in fact, already the idea of Ricci being associated in the history of the Jesuit China mission. I think the cover that you have of this where you have Francis Xavier and Matteo Ricci already on the same page, and then the different changes that arrived later on, and then the reconstruction in the 20th century illustrates well how we are in line with all kind of reinterpretations of Matteo Ricci. So we move to our second speaker, that is Xuyi. He is originally from Shanxi in China. He was ordained a deacon in China, but he was ordained priest in Macerata. As you all know, Macerata is the place from which Matteo Ricci originates. There he is responsible. He founded and also is the researcher and the director of the Centro Studi di Limato a Macerata. So it's important that you have the Limato, the name, the Chinese name of Matteo Ricci, and he is also teaching in several institutions. So I give him the floor for his speech, and he will speak in Italian. Yeah.
Buon pomeriggio a tutti. Vorrei ringraziare l'organizzatore, in modo particolare padre Federico Lombardi, che mi ha fatto così il nome, e sono l'ultimo tra i relatori. Sono davvero onorato di essere qui. Visto siamo in pomeriggio, tutti un po' anche a sentire le relazioni, cerco di essere più leggero, allora cerco di non leggere la relazione, quindi per la mia relazione volevo così proprio a sottolineare l'integrità della persona e della missione di padre Matteo Ricci. Quando si parla di padre Matteo Ricci, allora che lui di Macerata ha vissuto 16 anni a Macerata, io mi considero anche metà maceratese, più di 20 anni che vivo a Macerata, quindi ho vissuto più lungo di padre Matteo Ricci a casa sua. Ci sono tanti fraintendimenti sulla persona di padre Matteo Ricci. Io direi così, seguendo i suggerimenti degli organizzatori, quindi vorrei anche proporre un po' dalla prospettiva o un'altra versione da un cinese. Vorrei citare una poesia di Xuyi, famoso poeta cinese, 横看成岭侧成峰, 远近高低各不同, che dalla mattina fino alla sera che abbiamo sentito, tutti ha parlato di padre Matteo Ricci, ma ognuno da un punto di vista diverso. Io sono molto contento, certo che diverse cose che l'avevo scritto, non sapendo gli altri relatori cosa l'hanno scritto, quindi quelli che sono stati già menzionati, parlati, quindi cerco di saltare. Questa poesia sarebbe, diciamo, che dal punto di vista, no? Quindi dal laterale o diciamo da un'altra versione, guardando sempre questa montagna, sarebbe Lushan, e da una parte si vede come collina, da un'altra parte si vede come una montagna, da lontano, da vicino, e si vede diversamente. Chi sta solo all'interno della montagna, diciamo solo in montagna, non riesce a comprendere che cosa è questa montagna. Allora, non per fare una lezione sulla poesia cinese, ma questo vorrei sottolineare proprio il realismo sapienziale di padre Matteo Ricci, che lui, con questa mentalità, con padre Antonio Olmi abbiamo così insieme tradotto dal testo antico, quindi cinese, di Xuyi, il vero significato di Signore del Cielo, direttamente dal cinese all'italiano, quindi 4 occhi. E abbiamo scoperto che lui, così con la matrice tomista, che è la formazione generale di allora non solo gesuiti, comunemente erano così la preparazione, questo realismo sapienziale intendo come tutti hanno visto diversamente questa montagna e dalla loro così versione o prospettiva è sempre vera. Però l'unica cosa che rimane è quella realtà, rimane, anche se diversi punti di vista. Quindi questo padre Matteo Ricci ha vissuto. certo, lui come un missionario, così come la persona, io vorrei sottolineare innanzitutto una persona di amicizia, quindi amichevole, con rispetto e fondando sulla dignità umana. Tanto che diciamo, il primo libro di Xuyi scritto in cinese sull'amicizia è coraggiosa e corretta, giusta. Perché dicevo questo? Essendo uno appena arrivato in missione a Goa, lui scrive anche delle lettere ai superiori proprio per presentare alcune cose secondo lui che non vanno, perché gli indigeni, quindi indiani, erano un po' messi a parte per istruzione, e questo non solo in India, quindi anche in Cina o diciamo le altre parti. Lui, cercando di far sapere questo, poi anche la persona, come la persona così coraggiosa, dicevo, nel 1605 a Pechino lui scrisse una lettera al superiore dicendo a Manila hanno fatto un massacro dei cinesi, i spagnoli, quindi più di 20.000 che sono stati uccisi. Ma intanto non sta in Cina, però lui ha voluto fare diciamo, questo, forse anche avrà un impatto sulla nostra missione in Cina. E intanto anche contattando diciamo, tutti gli amici in Europa perché queste cose non accadano e poi possano vivere così nello spirito evangelico. Una persona molto, molto umile, così scrisse allora al padre Acquaviva, il che servirà parimenti per ricordare che sto qui molto apparecchiato con la grazia del Signore Dio pur per tutto quello che di me vorrà disporre, benché io per poco sia buono e per niente, e lasciando me da parte, che come dissi, per nessuna cosa sono buono e tutti stanno molto bene occupati in varie cose. E la sua umiltà, fin dall'inizio, che ha messo sempre nella pratica, infatti colpisce profondamente tutti coloro che hanno vissuto accanto a Padre Matteo Ricci. Quindi lui non si considerava di essere così ingenio e così bravo. Allora è anche una persona così caritatevole nel momento sia di inondazione, il momento dell'epidemia. Lui è stato sempre vicino alle persone che vittime di questi disastri naturali e anche assistendoli di persona. Quindi con quelli pochi mezzi che avevano, non entro nei dettagli a leggere, quindi quello che volevo dire, fra intendimento che molti pensano di Padre Matteo Ricci perché lui l'aveva preso una via del VIP, quindi sempre in contatto, come stamattina sono stati menzionati, allora perché con i funzionari, con i letterati, con i mandarini, eccetera. Invece lui, nella vita quotidiana, forse non fa tantissime notizie, o perlomeno oggi non viene parlato, così ho menzionato poco. Lui è così caritatevole, amichevole, tutte quelle persone che capiscono anche la sua santità. Infatti noi così diciamo dopo menzioniamo ancora come viene fatto. Volevo dire che come Padre Matteo Ricci la sua così all'inizio la mentalità senz'altro come il figlio dell'epoca, come tanti altri missionari, anche portato di evangelizzare direttamente, quindi come tutte le altre parti del mondo hanno evangelizzato, l'hanno battezzato un certo numero, magari migliaia, milioni di persone, e invece qui tanti anni, tra virgolette, il frutto non si vedeva molto evidente. Lui certo anche soffre, però si è reso conto, come stamattina il cardinale Parolin l'ha sottolineato, diciamo anche i papi che hanno proprio sottolineato l'identità di missionaria di Padre Matteo Ricci. Come missionario in partenza, ma quando si trova in cena, allora così che vi volevo dire che mette primo posto è la fede, quindi evangelizzazione, il messaggio cristiano e la fede. Questo è il libro, sarebbe diciamo il convegno 2010, l'avevamo fatto a Macerata, c'era anche padre Nicolas, quindi l'abbiamo fatto, si intitola questo nome, Scienza, ragione, fede, il genio di Padre Matteo Ricci, che come missionario, parlando di fede, infatti spieghiamo perché lui voleva subito far capire ai cinesi la loro identità religiosa vestendo da punzi buddisti. Dopo diversi anni, anche sui consigli degli amici, si è reso conto che non è così viene concepito o compreso, quindi cambia l'idea. Direi qua gli amici cinesi l'hanno davvero molto contribuito sulla sua conoscenza, quindi inizia anche a scendere così diciamo la ragione, dialogando con i letterati cinesi, ma la voglia anche con le scienze. Invece i cinesi siamo talmente pratici, vogliamo vedere, anche toccare le cose, quindi per aumentare la nostra così credibilità, Padre Matteo Ricci inizia anche a prendere, quindi prima come la mentalità, perlomeno io penso in questo modo, allora fede, ragione e scienza. Ora con l'aiuto o diciamo anche dialoghi, diciamo, piano piano si cambia l'ordine di queste cose, quindi passa magari prima la scienza e poi ragione e poi la fede, non perché non gli importava di annunciare la buona notizia, quindi evangelizzare direttamente, ma perché per parlare ai cinesi serve anche di farci comprendere anche le cose tangibili, è quello che noi viviamo. Ecco, diciamo, la seconda parte, quando parlo, diciamo, di questo, l'eredità di Padre Matteo Ricci, proprio volevo sentire questo. Oggi sicuramente in Cina scienza è più in rilievo, sappiamo quale motivo, diciamo, viene sottolineato, quindi anche nei libri manuali parlando di Padre Matteo Ricci come un scienziato o diciamo come uno così ragione apertura, dialogo, stimati dagli intellettuali, fede come il frutto dell'evangelizzazione senza interruzione da allora in poi, ecco, diciamo che inizia a cambiare l'ordine. Forse chi dice ma Giovanni Battista che cosa sta parlando di questo? Con una mentalità cinese noi vogliamo spesso dalle cose visibili di arrivare anche alle cose invisibili, o diciamo se vuoi consigliare un amico non possiamo fare la discussione dibattito per convincere l'altro, soprattutto con i cinesi non funziona. Di creare un legame di amicizia, di confidenza e poi dopo aver sentito questo affetto, questa stima dalla persona che mi consiglia, allora io posso anche accettare la correzione, l'aiuto, eccetera. Quindi non è così evidente. Per le discussioni io vorrei sottolineare perlomeno una cosa, così Padre Matteo Ricci, dialogando con i letterati cinesi, soprattutto ha scritto nel vero significato del Signore del Cielo, che cosa succede? Tutti parlano dell'intenzione per parlare delle virtù. Per i confuciani le virtù, allora chi vuole praticare la virtù, secondo il letterato cinese, è meglio non avere intenzione, quindi supera questi interessi. Invece Padre Matteo Ricci dice, ma questi interessi o diciamo le intenzioni anche per praticare la virtù è necessaria. Stiamo parlando della libertà dell'uomo con la grazia così soprannaturale. Iniziando tutte queste discussioni, il letterato occidentale non riesce a convincere più di tanto, allora continua questa discussione. Padre Matteo Ricci inizia a fare un esempio concreto, con la mentalità del realismo sapienziale. Sentite bene. Allora, le intenzioni sono importanti. Come uno cerca interesse. Se per chi che ama il denaro, il guadagno è importante. Quando tu parli delle cose spirituali, non capiscono. Tu devi parlare anche del guadagno. Allora, su questo sembra accendere. No, non vogliamo parlare, diciamo, delle cose più importanti o, diciamo, spirituali. E invece, qui Padre Matteo Ricci fa un esempio chiaro. Diciamo, si vede genialità di Padre Matteo Ricci nel modo in cui presenta la legge evangelica. Quindi quella rivelata, la legge di amore, di grazia, di libertà, la perfezione della vita cristiana in senso assoluto va desunta dalla carità in senso relativo delle altre virtù. Per far comprendere quelle persone magari cercano interessi, cercano il guadagno a dedicare alle virtù. Lui ha fatto un esempio per me davvero formidabile. Così dice, ad esempio, il filo di seta è usato per ricamare i vestiti, ma se non si usano aghi di ferro, il filo non può penetrare il tessuto. Una volta che l'ago abbia penetrato il tessuto, passa oltre, e ciò che resta sul vestito è soltanto il filo di seta. Sentite bene, diciamo, questo esempio. Allora, parlando con le persone che cercano il guadagno, l'interesse e a delle virtù, sembra, diciamo, troppo così con le gambe tra le nuvole. Lui diceva, ma possiamo parlare anche del guadagno, ma un guadagno che dura, come il tesoro accumulato in cielo. Questo esempio che lui diceva, noi oggi passiamo, come lui, io direi che qualcuno dice, diciamo, usare o utilizzare, diciamo, la scienza, ma in realtà è nell'unità. Tutto che viene, come dicevo, è in montagna. Quindi questa versione che lui dice, parliamo del guadagno, dell'interesse, come l'ago. Un ago che per cucire un vestito, questo filo di seta, senza gli aghi, non passa sul tessuto. Però chi che dopo aver cucito un vestito lascia gli aghi sul vestito? Interessante su questo. Quindi lui dice, ma allora in questo modo noi possiamo certamente di cambiare una mentalità, quindi incoraggiando le persone a vivere cercando le cose buone, sante e anche evangeliche, ma con le cose di vita quotidiana. Quindi, come concludere, io vorrei usare questa parola che Padre Matteo Ricci stesso, sul letto del dolore, l'ultimo giorno della sua vita a Pechino, dicendo non solo ai suoi confratelli, ma anche ai neofiti che lo circondano, perché i confratelli l'hanno chiesto che cosa ci consigli allora della missione di lasciare una parola. Il buon padre, dice, aggiunse per ognuno particolare incoraggiamento alla virtù. Come dicevo, la virtù, così habitus, che cucito da l'ago, quindi da interessi o diciamo le cose tangibili, materiali, ma porta una cosa molto più elevata. Infine disse, vi lascio una soglia aperta a grandi meriti, ma senza molti pericoli e tribolazioni. Quindi questa porta, o diciamo questo ponte che da lui costruito noi siamo tutti invitati a costruire e di camminare, scambiare, ma per una umanità. Direi di uscire dai nostri così piccoli cerchi di chiusura, e allora iniziamo anche a apprezzare che davvero sotto il cielo siamo tutti una famiglia con lo stesso Padre Celeste, ossia il Signore del cielo. Grazie di tutto.
So thank you very much for bringing us further perspectives, as you mentioned, on Matteo Ricci. I maybe want to link some of the talks we had today. We started with the talk about the context in which, it was said that there was a context of 社学, the concrete studies, 社学. And that's maybe already interesting to see that the book that Matteo Ricci published is called Tianzhu Xuyi.
Sì, questa è la
You have also translation, but you use also the word vero, and in English it's the true meaning.
Sì.
But is it true? Is it not better to say the solid meaning, the concrete meaning? Because the 学学 is not about truth. It is about something, how does this become solid? Not Wang Yangming, whatever,
Yes.
but something concrete. So that's a first link I want to make with what you say. Then you made the development on and the progress on faith. And there I want to link with the talk by Valentina. So what is Matteo Ricci in that story doing? He's not proclaiming faith. He goes to rituals, effective rituals. And so that links us to, I think when we focus on Tianzhu Xuyi and on the writings of Matteo Ricci, we have the theology, which is very nice, and also it has been very original. But what about how faith becomes concrete in rituals also? The 学 of the solidity and is also the rituals. And that was present in that story. And in fact, it is very obvious in the work by Trigault. And I would say the work by Trigault on Ricci, because Ricci could not write his own funeral. That's written by Trigault. And in fact, this ritual, the funeral of Matteo Ricci, has been a major shift in ritual practice in China. To be very honest, Matteo Ricci was not always very open to other rituals. For his funerals, the Jesuits who died in China had to be buried according to European ways, which meant they had to be buried near a church. So the bodies of the Jesuits were carried to Macau to be buried there. The first real exception is Matteo Ricci. So Matteo Ricci was buried in China, and there was a funeral. And as you probably know, a funeral is always an open ritual and not a closed ritual. What I mean by that, when you have a Eucharist, you can say you are not baptized, you cannot eat the host. But with the funeral, You cannot say, yeah, you were a friend or you were a friend of Matteo Ricci, but you are not a Christian, you are not allowed. No, everybody can participate in it. And so that comes that's the account, you have it in Trigault. And so I think that's also a nice way on the perspective that you are showing. The three, you have science, we discussed science this morning. We also have faith, but then there is also the aspect of the rituality that I think we have to rediscover also in Matteo Ricci, because that was very, let's say, present and active. So are there some more questions, or otherwise you can also react? Is there some questions? Maybe you want still to say something, or that was a kind of interaction with yours, but also the other papers. Given the time, we have to move onwards. The next talk will be an audio, as I already announced at the beginning. Unfortunately, Professor Clark from Whitworth University in Spokane, he had everything prepared to come, but he needs to undergo surgery, so he cannot attend, but he sent an audio of his contribution. So we will listen to this audio. Unfortunately, there will be no possibility to ask questions then. So I think they will prepare it, and there should be a picture, and then we can start the audio. But we will do that after giving again an applause to the speaker.
First, allow me to say how much I regret not being able to be there with you. I have many old friends who I was eager to see, and many others who I was hoping to meet and become new friends. I'm recording my remarks only because I'm scheduled to receive surgical treatment on my heart during this gathering. My intention here is to consider Father Matteo Ricci's legacy, that is, his lasting impact after his life in China, rather than to rehearse his actions during his life in China. Early Chinese writers, such as the Han Dynasty historian Bangu, insisted that it is only in retrospect that we can accurately judge a person of the past. Ban wrote that a good historian, quote, does not falsify what is good, nor does he conceal what is bad. 不许美，不隐恶. One hears much about the life of Matteo Ricci, and much of what one hears is hagiographical. Ricci himself was a model of Bangu's standard of truthfulness about the good and bad of what he discussed. And he would be the first person to exhort us to admit both his successes and failures as an intellectual and as a missionary. I first lived in Beijing during the 1990s, and since then I've visited Ricci's famous tomb many times. When Ricci lived in China during the late Ming Dynasty, he balanced his energies as a missionary with equal resolve to become more like the Chinese he met. He became more Chinese in his own habits and views in order to more effectively become a friend of China. After Ricci died in Beijing in 1610, a manuscript written by him in Italian was discovered among the papers he left behind. His confrere Nicolas Trigault brought these papers to Rome with him in 1614, published Ricci's narrative account of the mission in China in 1615 under the title De Christiana Expedizione apud Sinas, or On the Christian Mission in China. This work was the earliest history of the Catholic mission in China, and it reveals Ricci's keen commitment to bringing Christianity to China first and Western science second. He describes moving examples of Christian conversion in Shaozhou Ricci commends the missionary efforts of his fellow Jesuit, Father Niccolò Langobardo, who baptized a large number of local Chinese. Ricci recorded that after the rites of baptism, confirmation, and First Holy Communion, the new Chinese Christians celebrated with almost displays that were more common of Chinese officials than religious converts. He wrote, quote, "After returning to their homes, they were led out by the other converts to the sound of cymbals and trumpets. With the same display they are accustomed to make for a magistrate who had been promoted to a new dignity. During a period of 3 years, the Lord saw his harvest grow to 300 followers, a considerable number considering the difficulties encountered at the beginning," close quote. Following this account of how Chinese converts celebrated their reception into the church, Ricci described the circumstances of their conversions. He includes a long account of a 70-year-old man who, quote, "counseled others of his own age and led them into the church," close quote. Here we see one of the earliest examples of Matteo Ricci's method of entrusting the work of spreading Christianity to local Chinese, rather than preserve this enterprise only for Western missionaries. It is important to remember that Ricci and his fellow Jesuits were not mainly interested in science, cartography, and secular philosophy, and that their religious aspirations were always their priority. Scholars know that Ricci published secular works while living in China. His 1607 collaboration to publish Euclid's Elements in Chinese is a good example of Ricci's exertions to expose Western science to China's learned class. In a 1609 letter to the Father General of the Society of Jesus, Claudio Acquaviva, Father Ricci wrote, quote, "There is a great hope in the abundant fruit that is to be gained from such a vast kingdom as China. For in this kingdom, learning and consequently all sciences and opinions founded on reason are held in high esteem. And that is why it will be easy to persuade the rulers of this kingdom with our holy faith through evidence provided by reason. And if they concede, it will be easy to convert everyone else," close quote. Now, Ricci overconfidently expected that converting China to Catholicism would be, quote, "easy." But he astutely observed that science and reason would serve as effective methods of friendship and cultural bridges in the Ming Empire. Ricci may have published scientific works, produced the world map, and mastered the Confucian classics. But supporting all of these endeavors was an abiding conviction that all he did was intended to lead others to God. Now, here I should add that both Ricci's secular and religious efforts were always connected to a sense that friendship must be cherished, whether or not one's friend is a Christian. For Matteo Ricci, both conversion and community are essential, even if community is the only result of his life as a missionary in China. There is much evidence of Ricci's custom of collaboration with Chinese friends. This evidence appears in the preface of his Chinese translation of Euclid's Elements, published in Beijing under the title Ji He Yuanban. In the preface, we read an interesting assertion. The work is described as Limado Kouyi Xu Guangqi Bishou, or, quote, orally dictated by Matteo Ricci and written down by Xu Guangqi. Now, I envision Father Ricci and his friend Xu Guangqi sitting together, drinking warm tea, collaborating on a book that is now among the most celebrated Chinese translations of Western science from the Ming and Qing dynasties. This represents only one of many collaborations between Western and Chinese intellectuals during China's missionary era that resulted in the long Sino-Western exchange of technical and religious knowledge. Among the most lasting legacies that Ricci left in China was what scholars commonly refer to as, quote, indigenization, or what I prefer to call localization. Now, I personally prefer the term localization because the idea of indigenization of the Chinese church has been largely driven by non-Chinese. And I, for one, find it problematic when non-Chinese ecclesiastics promote their own ideas of what a, quote, Chinese church should look like without better allowing the Chinese themselves to form such a vision. Chinese Catholics have always insisted that creating their own localized church with its own Chinese hierarchy of bishops is paramount. Chinese bishops are best equipped to be the pastors of Chinese Christians. The Chinese Catholics I know have never desired a Chinese hierarchy independent of the Holy See, but rather one that, like all other local churches, is overseen by the people of their own culture. The first Chinese bishop, Gregory Luo Wenzhao, was consecrated in 1685, and no other Chinese priest was made a bishop until 1926, when Pope Pius XI consecrated 6 priests to the episcopate in St. Peter's Basilica. It took 241 years until native Chinese were allowed to govern their own church. When writing of the 1926 ordination of 6 Chinese bishops, the Jesuit scholar of Matteo Ricci, Father Pasquale Delia, asserted that, quote, a mission is a transitory step. What is permanent is the church. The mission, therefore, has to give up its place to the permanent church, close quote. In other words, by the early 20th century, the era of Western authority over China's church was finally giving way. One sees the seeds of this movement in the life and works of Matteo Ricci. By the 19th century and early 20th centuries, the popular imagination of Matteo Ricci in China was infused with the aesthetic and hagiographical sensibilities of Baroque Rome. The missionaries of the late Qing dynasty sought to emulate Ricci's example of localization, as if they were themselves, quote, little Riccis. Jesuits and members of other orders and congregations commonly posed for formal portraits with an image of Matteo Ricci and Xu Guangqi in the background. A portrait of Saint Léon Ignace Majan, taken during the 1890s, is a good example of how missionaries both had Ricci's image behind them and also how they dressed in Chinese clothing to emulate Ricci's appearance as a Chinese literatus rather than a Western priest in a black cassock. In addition to the aesthetic emulation of Ricci's example of, quote, being Chinese while living in China, close quote, Jesuits also wrote and staged plays in China to celebrate the witness of Chinese Catholics. Written by European Jesuits, forged in the kilns of garish Baroque sets in the vein of Gian Lorenzo Bernini, these plays were at once impassioned productions that seemed more Western than Chinese. But aesthetically, they were nearly indistinguishable from the stage performances one would have seen in traditional opera halls. In the aftermath of the Boxer Uprising, Jesuits collected the testimonies of first-hand observers who had lived through the conflicts of 1900. And based on those accounts, the French Jesuit Pierre Xavier Merton wrote and directed a Chinese play commemorating the massacre of 2 French Jesuits and several Chinese Christians, well, 2,000 or more Chinese Christians at the Catholic village of Zhujiahe, entitled Zhujiahe Zhimingju, or Drama of the Martyrs of Zhujiahe. Saint Majan, seen in this image, was one of those who perished in that attack. On Thursday, 1st of May, 1930, a crowd of spectators assembled in a massive courtyard in front of a temporary stage erected at the Jesuit school at Kaizhou village. The dramatic character of the performance was decidedly Baroque and decidedly inspired by Father Ricci's example of enculturization. The actors who were drawn from the school wore Chinese garb so that Ricci's legacy of localization could be emphasized. The costumes were a mixture of the robes and insignia of imperial officials and makeshift sartorial representations of local literati and Chinese Catholics. The characters depicting the massacred Christians are seen in the photographs wearing white and holding palm branches. Matteo Ricci's example of friendship and dialogue was, as Father Merton intended, underscored in his Chinese play about Chinese martyrs who had died on Chinese soil. Ricci's legacy of cultural dialogue had by the 19th century wedded Baroque content with Chinese stagecraft. I should also note that I should also add that Merton did not write his Chinese plays alone. He did so with other Chinese collaborators, similar to how Matteo Ricci wrote the Jihe Yuanban with Xu Guangqi. Among the most adamant followers of Ricci's method of localization were Father Vincent Leb and the first papal diplomat to China, Archbishop Celso Costantini. Costantini, despite opposition from several of his fellow bishops in China, all of them European, convened in Shanghai what he called the Primum Concilium Sinesi, or the First Plenary Council for China. Convened in Shanghai, held at the very famous Jesuit church named after St. Ignatius of Loyola. China's bishops gathered there to discuss how to follow Matteo Ricci's example and localize the Chinese church in areas from theology and liturgy to art and architecture. As the bishops formally processed from the church, it became evident that another topic must be confronted: the overwhelming majority of non-Chinese leaders who governed China's Catholics. Now, in a short film shot at the Shanghai Council, quite a rare film, we see just how visibly Western bishops overshadowed the Chinese in their own nation. Under Father Ricci's example of local empowerment, Costantini and his fellow European bishops sought to end the dominance of Western prelates in China. Let's see if we can get this clip to work. And here we see a rare film of Archbishop Costantini while he's in China at the 1926 Synod. Under Costantini's direction, a new wave of what we might call Sinicized Catholic art and architecture began to punctuate China's vast religious landscape. Print and carved images of Our Lady of China became more widely produced. Churches began to adopt Chinese aesthetic sensibilities, and liturgical vestments and vessels were made in Chinese designs and with Chinese materials. Now, as I reach the conclusion of my remarks, I should note a few final thoughts. A very large number of Jesuit missionaries followed in the footsteps of Matteo Ricci, inspired by the stories of his life in China, told and retold in Jesuit houses throughout the world. Among the remarkable materials held in the Society of Jesus Archive in Rome is a collection of letters written by Jesuits called Litterae Indipete to the generals asking to be sent abroad to mission territories. Now, in one part of the archive, there are 29 boxes containing 14,067 letters by about 6,167 Jesuits. And perhaps as many as 2,000 additional letters are held in other parts of the archive. These letters were written before the suppression of the society in 1773, and a very large portion of these requests asked to be sent to China to continue the work of the great Matteo Ricci. Countless Chinese encountered the gospel and became Christians under the influence of Jesuit missionaries who went to China because of the witness and legacy of Father Ricci. And it is important to bear in mind that it was Ricci himself who admitted the first two Chinese men into the Society of Jesus on 1st January 1591, Zhong Mingren and Huang Mingxia. It is accurate to say that the society in China was born under the influence, largely, of Matteo Ricci, and that the Jesuit mission after his death was encouraged by his example. So powerful was the Jesuit desire to go to China that, as Father Edward Malatesta has pointed out, droves of young Jesuits set out for China, despite the fact that, as Father Malatesta put it, quote, only 1/3 reached their destination due to sickness and disaster. I'll finish my remarks here about the long and gilded legacy of Father Matteo Ricci. Over the course of my many years in China, I have witnessed effusive admiration, the effusive admiration that Chinese Catholics have for this Jesuit from Macerata. Both members of the Communist Party and worshipers in China's churches agree that Ricci's legacy is one of cultural friendship and dialogue, but especially from the point of view of China's Catholic faithful, Matteo Ricci represents the witness of the Christian gospel and the holiness of a saint. I've heard this so often in China. Ricci is a shengren, a saint. Cries from the academic community call for Ricci's recognition as an apostle of the mind, and cries from the Catholic community call for santo subito, or sainthood now. Near the conclusion of Ricci's most famous classic, his Tianzhu Shiyi, the true meaning of the Lord of Heaven, Ricci wrote that, quote, to teach others about the events of the past and present, one need not be a saint. But I suggest that the legacy of what Father Ricci taught in the past and his influences on the present reveal him to be precisely that, a saint, who taught the church how to more effectively transform the Christian faith from one that is merely enculturated into one that is integrated with the fabric and the fabric of the culture that is already there. I'll end here. Thank you. And I ask for your prayers as I enter into my medical treatments. Thank you so much.
I think we can be very grateful for this wide overview, leading us starting from Matteo Ricci, but also reaching until the late 19th and also the early 20th century, how all the efforts for Sinicization were also inspired by Matteo Ricci. So I suggest that we transmit via Festo the warm regards to Anthony Clark, and that we appreciated very much also his contribution. So we are not yet at the end of our meeting, but we are at the end of this two academic sessions. I want again to thank all the contributors today, and to give such a wide and diverse and nuanced perspective on Matteo Ricci. That is, I think, very helpful for the academic and also the wider community.